The knock came 3 days after my father's funeral. By then, my husband had already laughed at my inheritance twice. The first time was in the lawyer's office. The second time was in our kitchen while stirring sugar into his coffee. But neither of those moments stayed with me. What stayed with me was what happened next. An 80-year-old man stood on my porch holding a weathered leather hat in both hands. His silver hair moved gently in the November wind. He looked past me straight into the house as if searching for something. Then his eyes settled on the small wooden box sitting on my dining table. His expression changed. Not surprise, recognition, almost relief. "Emily," he said quietly. I hadn't seen him in nearly 15 years. "Arthur," he nodded once. Then he asked the question that would change everything. "Have you opened the back of the watch yet?" For a moment I forgot how to breathe. Because until that second I had believed my grandfather's broken watch was the final insult in a lifetime full of disappointments. I had no idea it was actually the beginning. 3 days earlier, rain had fallen steadily across the cemetery outside Savannah. The kind of cold, southern rain that soaked through clothing without ever becoming a storm. My father, George Whitmore, had been buried beneath a gray sky and rows of dripping oak trees. I stood beside the grave holding a black umbrella while mud collected around my shoes. My brother Michael checked his phone every few minutes. My sister Caroline cried whenever someone approached and somehow stopped the second they walked away. My husband Richard stood beside me with one hand resting on my shoulder. From a distance, he probably looked supportive. I knew better. For most of the service, he spent more time watching the crowd than listening to the minister. My father had not been an easy man to love. He believed emotions were private. Praise was rare. Affection was even rarer. Yet despite all that, he was still my father. And standing beside his grave felt like watching an entire chapter of my life disappear into the ground. After the burial, we drove directly to the attorney's office. The building overlooked the Savannah River. Large windows, expensive furniture. The kind of place designed to remind people that important decisions happened there. Harold Finch, my father's attorney, looked exhausted. He was in his 70s now. His shoulders seemed smaller than I remembered. "Let's begin," he said quietly. Michael leaned forward immediately. Caroline crossed her legs. Richard sat back comfortably. The estate distribution happened exactly as everyone expected. Michael received the lake house, a beautiful property outside Asheville worth more than $1 million. Caroline received controlling ownership of Whitmore Consulting, the family company, the crown jewel, the thing both of them had been discussing behind closed doors for years. Then Harold looked at me and hesitated. Something about that pause made the room feel smaller. "Emily," he said carefully, "your father requested that you receive this personally." He reached beneath the desk and lifted a small wooden box. I remember blinking. That was it. No folder. No documents. No property deeds. Just a box. Harold handed it to me. Inside rested my grandfather's old pocket watch. The crystal was scratched. The leather strap was cracked. The hands hadn't moved in decades. It looked completely worthless. For 3 seconds, nobody said anything. Then Richard laughed. Actually laughed. A short, amused sound. "That's it." I looked at him. He shrugged. "I'm sorry, Em, I just thought there'd be more." Michael smirked. Caroline covered her mouth. I felt heat crawl slowly up my neck. Not because of the watch. Because everyone in the room seemed to agree. The watch was a joke. An afterthought. A consolation prize. Harold cleared his throat. "Your father specifically instructed me to give this item directly to Emily." Richard smiled. "Well, at least it's sentimental." The way he said sentimental made it sound like another word for worthless. I closed the box carefully. "Thank you," I told Harold. Then I stood up. I wasn't interested in performing humiliation for an audience. 25 years of marriage had taught me something important. People who enjoy seeing you embarrassed become disappointed when you refuse to participate. The drive home felt longer than usual. Richard spent most of it discussing property values. How much Michael could sell the lake house for. What Caroline might do with the company. By the time we reached our neighborhood, I was exhausted. Not physically. Emotionally. Our house sat on a quiet street lined with maple trees. We had lived there nearly 20 years. Raised our daughter there. Built a life there. At least I thought we had. That evening, I placed the watch on the kitchen counter. Richard walked past it and shook his head. "Your father always had strange priorities." I didn't answer. A few minutes later, he picked up the watch box. Examined it. Then set it down again. "Honestly," I looked up. He smiled. Not kindly. The smile people wear when they're trying not to sound cruel. "That's sad." Just 2 words. "That's sad." as if my father's final gift represented my value, as if my inheritance somehow measured my worth. I turned away and started washing dishes. The conversation ended there, or at least I thought it had. The next 2 days passed quietly. Richard left early for work, came home late, spent most evenings texting people while half watching television. Nothing unusual, at least not anymore. By the third morning, the watch sat untouched inside its wooden box on the dining table. I hadn't opened it again. I hadn't wanted to. Every time I looked at it, I heard Richard laughing. I heard Michael smirking. I heard Caroline whispering. So I left it alone. Then came the knock. 3 sharp taps. Precise. Deliberate. I opened the door expecting a delivery driver. Instead, I found Arthur Sullivan standing there. My father's oldest friend. The man who had known my family longer than anyone still alive. He looked older than I remembered. Thinner, but his eyes were exactly the same. Clear, steady, the eyes of someone who paid attention. Arthur, hello, Emily. For a second, neither of us moved. Then he glanced past me, toward the dining room, toward the wooden box. His expression tightened. Not fear, urgency. May I come in? I stepped aside immediately. He entered slowly. His gaze never left the watch. The room seemed strangely quiet. Even the refrigerator hum felt distant. Arthur removed his coat, set his hat down carefully, then pointed toward the wooden box. Tell me something. I frowned. What? He looked directly at me. Have you opened the back of the watch yet? The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Because suddenly I realized something. Arthur wasn't asking out of curiosity. He already knew the answer. And somehow, he had been waiting years to ask it. For several seconds, I simply stared at Arthur. The question felt strangely specific. Not, have you looked at the watch? Not, did your father leave you anything? But, have you opened the back of the watch yet? Arthur watched my face carefully. When I didn't answer immediately, he nodded. That's what I thought. I folded my arms. Arthur, what exactly are you talking about? Instead of answering, he walked slowly toward the dining table. The wooden box sat exactly where I had left it. For some reason, seeing another person focus on that old watch made it feel different. Less like junk. More like something waiting. Arthur lifted the box gently. Not the way someone handles an object. The way someone handles a memory. His thumb brushed across the worn leather strap. For a moment, I saw something pass through his eyes. Grief. Not fresh grief. The kind that settles into a person after decades. Your grandfather carried this watch every day for almost 40 years, he said quietly. I pulled out a chair. So, Arthur looked up. So Walter Whitmore wasn't the kind of man who carried useless things. That sounded exactly like my grandfather. Even as a child, I remembered how careful he was. Every tool had a place. Every promise mattered. Every dollar was accounted for. Nothing was wasted. Arthur turned the watch over. Your father never told you much about him, did he? I laughed softly. My father didn't tell me much about anyone. A faint smile touched Arthur's face. Fair point. He sat down across from me. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Sunlight filtered through the dining room window. Outside, leaves drifted across the lawn. Inside, everything felt strangely still. Finally, Arthur took a slow breath. Your grandfather and I met in 1962. I listened. We were 20 years old, broke, ambitious, convinced we knew everything. The smile returned briefly. We were both wrong. I couldn't help smiling back. Arthur continued. We worked at a small shipbuilding company outside Charleston. Long hours, terrible pay. But Walter was different. Different how? He never chased money. Arthur looked down at the watch. He chased trust. The answer surprised me. Arthur nodded as if he'd expected that reaction. Most people spend their lives trying to become important. Walter spent his life trying to become dependable. Something tightened slightly in my chest. Because that sounded familiar. Painfully familiar. For years I had done the same thing. Taking care of everyone. Showing up. Staying. Holding families together while nobody noticed. Arthur glanced at me. He saw that quality in you. I looked away. My father didn't. Arthur was quiet for a moment. No. The honesty stung less than I expected. Because at 52 years old, pretending otherwise seemed pointless. Arthur gently tapped the back of the watch. He wanted you to have this. Why? Because he trusted you. I almost laughed. Everyone seemed to trust me with responsibilities. Very few people trusted me with anything valuable. Arthur must have sensed the thought. You're thinking about the lake house. I said nothing. The company. Still nothing. The fact that your husband laughed. That one landed. Arthur studied me carefully. You know something interesting about loyalty, Emily. What? The people who benefit most from it are often the least likely to appreciate it. Silence settled between us. Not uncomfortable. Heavy. Like truth usually is. Then Arthur reached into his pocket and removed a tiny eyeglass screwdriver. I blinked. What is that for? Instead of answering, he held out his hand. May I? I handed him the watch. His fingers moved with surprising precision. Carefully. Patiently. Like someone following instructions he had memorized years ago. He pressed the screwdriver against a nearly invisible groove near the winding stem. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, click! A soft metallic sound echoed across the room. My heartbeat immediately quickened. The back panel popped open. I leaned forward. What the? Arthur smiled. Your grandfather always enjoyed surprises. Inside the watch was a hidden compartment. A compartment I never would have found on my own. And inside that compartment rested 3 items. A tiny brass key, a folded piece of paper, and a sealed envelope yellowed by age. For a moment, neither of us moved. The room felt impossibly quiet. Arthur nodded toward them. Go ahead. My hands shook slightly as I removed the folded paper first. The paper was old. Very old. Carefully unfolding it, I found a handwritten address. First Coastal Trust Bank, Jacksonville, Florida. Beneath it sat a box number. And a date. 23 years ago. I looked up. What is this? Arthur didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pointed toward the envelope. The paper crackled softly as I opened it. Inside sat a single handwritten note. The handwriting was unmistakable. My grandfather's. I had seen it dozens of times growing up. Birthday cards, Christmas gifts, letters. The message contained only one sentence. For the one who understands loyalty. That was it. Nothing else. No explanation. No instructions. Just one sentence. For the one who understands loyalty. I read it again, then a third time. Something about those words made my throat tighten. Because loyalty had defined most of my life. I stayed when things became difficult. I stayed through layoffs, through illnesses, through disappointments, through a marriage that had slowly become colder than either of us admitted. Arthur watched me carefully. He knew you'd be the one. How? Because your grandfather paid attention. I lowered the note. Arthur's expression softened. Most people only notice confidence. He pointed toward the message. Walter noticed character. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then a new question occurred to me. A very important one. Did my father know about this? Arthur looked out the window. The pause told me everything. Yes, the word hit harder than expected. My father knew. All these years. And never said a word. Arthur leaned back slowly. George made me a promise. What kind of promise? If the watch ever came back into your possession, I was to find you immediately. I stared at him. Immediately, within 24 hours. A strange chill ran through me. Why? Arthur's eyes settled on the key resting in my palm. Because your grandfather believed the contents of that safety deposit box would matter most when you finally saw people clearly. I frowned. What does that mean? Arthur gave a small, sad smile. That's something you'll have to discover yourself. The answer irritated me and intrigued me at the same time. I looked down at the brass key, then at the bank address, then at the note. For the one who understands loyalty. A sudden memory surfaced. Richard laughing in the attorney's office. That's sad. I pushed the thought away. Arthur stood. How quickly can you pack a bag? I blinked. What? We're driving to Jacksonville. My pulse quickened. Today. I looked at the clock. Just after noon. Everything about this felt unreal. 3 days ago, I thought my inheritance was a broken watch. Now I was holding a key to something my grandfather had hidden for more than 2 decades. Arthur picked up his coat. His expression had become serious again. Emily, what? When we opened that box? He stopped. For the first time since arriving, he seemed genuinely nervous. There's a chance you're going to learn things your father never wanted discussed while he was alive. The room suddenly felt colder. What kind of things? Arthur looked at me for several long seconds. Then he answered quietly. The kind that change how you see the people closest to you. And for reasons I couldn't explain, my first thought wasn't about my father. It was about my husband. The drive to Jacksonville took a little over 2 hours. Arthur insisted on driving. I didn't argue. My thoughts were already crowded enough. The farther we traveled down Interstate 95, the quieter I became. The brass key sat inside my purse. The folded note rested beside it. For the one who understands loyalty. I must have read those words 20 times before we crossed the Florida state line. Every time they seemed to mean something slightly different. Arthur didn't force conversation. That was one thing I had always appreciated about him. Some people feel silence because they're uncomfortable with it. Arthur respected it. Around 3:30 we pulled into the parking lot of First Coastal Trust Bank. The building didn't look remarkable. Red brick, white columns, neatly trimmed hedges. The kind of place most people would drive past without noticing. Yet something about it felt important. Permanent. Like it had been waiting. Arthur parked. Neither of us moved immediately. Finally, he looked over at me. "You ready?" "No." He nodded. "Good." I frowned. "Good." The truth usually arrives before we're ready for it. That sounded like something my grandfather would have said. A few minutes later, we entered the bank. The lobby was quiet. Polished floors. Soft lighting. The faint scent of old paper and coffee. A woman at the front desk greeted us politely. Then Arthur introduced himself. The change in her expression was immediate. Not dramatic, but noticeable. She picked up the phone, spoke quietly, then stood. "Please follow me." My pulse quickened. We were escorted through a secure hallway and into a private vault room. An older man waited there. The branch manager. Gray suit. Silver hair. Professional smile. But the second he saw the key in my hand, something shifted. Recognition. The same look Arthur had given the watch. The manager cleared his throat. "Miss Whitmore." "Yes." He nodded. "We've been instructed to assist you whenever you arrived." I blinked. "Whenever I arrived?" "Yes, ma'am." "How long have those instructions existed?" The manager checked a document, then looked up. 23 years. The number hit me harder than expected. 23 years. Someone had been waiting for me for 23 years. The manager led us to a large safety deposit drawer. I inserted the key. My hands trembled slightly. The lock turned. A soft click echoed through the room. The drawer slid open. For a moment, nobody spoke. Inside sat several sealed envelopes, a collection of old photographs, legal documents, and 3 thick folders. I stared. This wasn't a hidden treasure. It was an archive. A carefully preserved record. Arthur quietly stepped back, giving me space. The first envelope carried my grandfather's handwriting. Emily. Nothing else. Just my name. I opened it first. Inside was a short letter. My grandfather's words felt startlingly alive despite the years. "Emily, if you are reading this, then the watch found its way back to you. That means I was right. People often confuse loyalty with weakness. They are wrong. The strongest people are usually the ones who stay, the ones who show up, the ones who continue loving others after receiving very little in return. There are things in this box that your father promised to protect until the right time. Trust Arthur. Trust yourself. And remember this. The truth does not destroy good people. It only reveals them. Love. Grandpa Walter." I lowered the letter slowly. The room felt unusually warm. Arthur remained silent. The manager quietly left, leaving us alone. I opened the second envelope. This one carried my father's handwriting. Immediately my stomach tightened. My father rarely wrote letters. In fact, I could count the number I'd received from him on one hand. I unfolded the pages carefully. "Emily, if you're reading this, then I am gone. There are things I should have told you years ago. I didn't. Partly because I was afraid. Partly because I believed protecting you meant keeping certain truths hidden. Maybe I was wrong." The first few lines already felt heavier than anything my father had ever said aloud. I continued reading. "Several years ago, I hired a private investigator. Not because of you. Because of Richard." The words seemed to stop time. I read them again. "Because of Richard. My husband." My chest tightened. Arthur lowered his eyes. He already knew. Of course he knew. The letter continued. "At first I suspected financial dishonesty. The investigation revealed something else. Something far worse. Richard has been unfaithful. For years." I stopped breathing. Not dramatically. Not visibly. Just stopped. The words blurred slightly. I blinked, then forced myself to continue. "I wanted to tell you. Many times. But every time I tried, I saw how much you loved him. I convinced myself that you deserved happiness even if it was built on lies. That may have been my greatest mistake." I stared at the page. My father knew. My father had known. "How long?" The answer arrived several lines later. 8 years. 8 years. I felt physically cold. 8 years. 8 years of family dinners, birthdays, vacations, anniversaries. 8 years of smiling photographs. 8 years of shared beds, shared plans, shared conversations. 8 years. The number felt impossible. Arthur quietly poured a glass of water and placed it beside me. I didn't touch it. I kept reading. The investigators' reports are included in the 3rd folder. I hope you never need them. But if you do, they belong to you. I am sorry, Emily. More than you know? I folded the letter slowly. Neither Arthur nor I spoke. Outside the vault room, distant footsteps echoed through the hallway. The world continued moving. Mine had stopped. Finally, I looked up. When did you know? Arthur's answer came immediately. The same day your father found out. I closed my eyes. Of course. You never told me. No. The honesty hurt, but not as much as the alternative. Why? Arthur sighed. Because your father made me promise. I laughed once. A hollow sound. Everyone keeps making promises for my benefit. Arthur didn't defend himself. That made me respect him even more. Instead, he simply said, I'm sorry. The words landed differently than I expected. Not because they fixed anything, because they sounded genuine. Eventually, I reached for the 3rd folder, the investigator's file. The folder felt heavier than paper should. Inside were reports, dates, addresses, photographs. I stared at the first image, and immediately wished I hadn't. Richard, my husband, standing beside a woman I had never seen before, his arm around her waist, both smiling, comfortably, naturally, like people who belonged together. The timestamp sat in the corner. 8 years ago. I flipped to the next photo, then another, and another. Different restaurants, different cities, different years, always the same woman, always Richard. The relationship wasn't casual. It wasn't recent. It wasn't a mistake. It was a second life. A carefully maintained second life. By the time I reached the final photograph, my hands had gone numb. Arthur watched quietly, not interrupting, not offering explanations, just waiting. Then I reached the last page, and froze. The photograph was newer than all the others, far newer, only 6 months old. Richard stood outside an apartment building. The woman kissed him. His hand rested against her face. The intimacy was unmistakable, but it wasn't the woman that caught my attention. It was the address. Because I recognized it. I had driven past that building dozens of times. And suddenly a horrifying realization settled into place. Richard hadn't hidden his second life in another state, or another city. He had hidden it 20 minutes from our house. I didn't speak for almost the entire drive home. Arthur didn't push. He simply drove while late afternoon sunlight stretched across the highway. The investigator's folder sat on my lap. Closed. I couldn't bring myself to open it again. I already knew enough. Or at least I thought I did. The truth was, I knew Richard had betrayed me. What I didn't know yet was how deeply. Around 6:30, we pulled into my driveway. My house looked exactly the same. The same white shutters. The same maple tree in the front yard. The same porch swing I'd painted myself 12 years earlier. Funny how ordinary everything appears when your life is quietly falling apart. Arthur turned off the engine. You want me to come inside? I considered it, then shook my head. No. He nodded. If you need me, call. I managed a small smile. I will. Before leaving, Arthur hesitated. Emily. Yes. Don't make decisions tonight. I understood immediately. He wasn't talking about divorce. He was talking about anger, about pain, about acting before thinking. I won't. His eyes studied me for a moment. Then he drove away. I sat in my car long after he disappeared. Eventually, I gathered the folders and walked inside. The house was quiet. Richard wasn't home yet. Part of me felt relieved. Part of me felt disappointed. For years, I had imagined what I would say if I ever discovered an affair. In those fantasies, there were dramatic confrontations. Shouting, accusations, doors slamming. Reality felt different. Quieter. Colder. More exhausting. I placed the folders on the dining table. Then I made myself a cup of tea. Not because I wanted tea. Because I needed something ordinary. Something familiar. By the time Richard arrived home, it was nearly 8 o'clock. He entered carrying takeout containers. Smiling. Relaxed. Comfortable. The sight nearly broke my heart. Not because I loved him. Because I suddenly realized how little I knew him. Hey, he said. Hey. He kissed my cheek. The same way he always did. The same way he probably kissed me after seeing her. My stomach turned. You eat yet? No. I grabbed Chinese. He held up the bag. Then noticed my expression. You okay? The question almost made me laugh. 8 years. 8 years of lies. And now he was asking if I was okay. I'm tired. That part wasn't a lie. He nodded. Long week. Long week? My father died. My inheritance turned into a mystery. I discovered my husband had another woman. And somehow those 2 words felt absurdly inadequate. Long week. Richard disappeared into the kitchen. A few minutes later, I heard him laughing softly, texting someone. The sound echoed through the house. I found myself wondering whether it was her. The thought made me physically ill. That night after Richard fell asleep, I returned to the dining room. The investigator's folder waited where I'd left it. Moonlight spilled through the windows. The house felt strangely unfamiliar, like I was visiting someone else's life. I opened the folder again. This time I forced myself to read everything. Every report, every note, every timeline. And slowly a larger picture emerged. The affair wasn't the only secret. Far from it. There were financial records, property documents, bank transfers, expense reports. I frowned. The numbers repeated, again and again. The same account, the same destination, the same apartment complex. At midnight, I finally found the document that made everything click. A property purchase agreement. I stared at the address, then at the purchaser's name. Not Richard Carter. A limited liability company. One created 9 years earlier. The investigator had traced it. Richard was the owner. I leaned back slowly. The apartment belonged to him. Not rented. Owned. My husband hadn't been visiting another woman's apartment. He had bought it. For her. The realization hit harder than the photographs. Because photographs show emotion. Money shows commitment. For nearly a decade, Richard had been funding another life. And somehow I had never seen it. The next morning, I called the investigator whose name appeared throughout the reports. To my surprise, he answered, "Retired now. Older, but willing to speak." After confirming who I was, he became quiet. "Your father loved you very much." The statement caught me off guard. I wasn't expecting that. I wasn't even sure I believed it. "He hired you." "Yes." "What did he want?" The investigator sighed. "At first, financial information." I waited. But after a few months, the focus changed. "To Richard." "Yes." The answer came gently, almost apologetically. I stared out the dining room window. "What else did you find?" A long pause followed. Then, "More than your father ever wanted to know." The conversation lasted nearly an hour. When it ended, I sat motionless, because the affair wasn't merely emotional or physical. Richard had used company funds from his business. Not illegally. Not enough to trigger investigations. But enough. Enough gifts. Enough transfers. Enough expenses. Enough hidden support. Over the years, thousands upon thousands of dollars had quietly disappeared. Money I assumed was helping our future. Money that had actually been building someone else's. That afternoon, Arthur called. I told him everything. He listened carefully. Then said something unexpected. "There's one more thing." My stomach tightened. "There always is." A soft chuckle came through the phone. "Your grandfather believed secrets should reveal themselves in stages." "Wonderful." Arthur laughed. Then his voice became serious. "There's another folder." I frowned. "What folder?" "The one underneath the property documents." I immediately opened the safety deposit box materials again. Sure enough, a smaller folder rested beneath everything else. I hadn't noticed it. My pulse quickened. Inside were legal papers, trust documents, investment statements. At first, none of it made sense. Then I saw the total and nearly dropped the file. $18 million. I stared. Read it again. Then a third time. Still $18 million. The trust had been established by my grandfather. Expanded over decades. Quiet investments. Conservative growth. Long-term planning. Arthur spoke softly. "Your father never touched it." I could barely process the number. "Why?" "Because it wasn't his." I lowered myself into a chair. My hands suddenly felt weak. The trust named one beneficiary. Me. Only me. No Michael. No Caroline. No shared distribution. No equal division. Just me. A single sentence explained why. For the grandchild who demonstrates loyalty above ambition. I sat there for a long time. Not celebrating. Not smiling. Just absorbing. Because somehow the money mattered less than the reason. For the first time in my life, someone had chosen me. Not because I was useful. Not because I was responsible. Not because I cleaned up other people's mistakes. Because they trusted my character. I was still staring at the documents when Richard arrived home that evening. He looked unusually cheerful, almost excited. The sight immediately made me suspicious. "Good day," I asked. He loosened his tie. Actually, yes. Then he sat down across from me. His expression changed. Not happy anymore. Determined. My stomach tightened. Emily. The tone told me everything. 27 years of marriage had taught me that tone. The serious conversation tone. The prepared speech tone. The tone people use when they've rehearsed something. Yes. Richard folded his hands, took a breath, then looked directly into my eyes. I think we should talk about getting a divorce. The room went completely silent, and for the first time since discovering the affair, I wasn't surprised. For a moment I simply looked at him. Not because I was shocked, because I wasn't. The surprise had happened days earlier inside a bank vault. The surprise had happened the moment I saw the photographs. The moment I learned about the apartment. The moment I realized my father had spent years trying to protect me from a truth I wasn't ready to face. Number? This wasn't surprising. It was confirmation. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Apparently my silence wasn't following the script he'd imagined. Emily, I folded my hands calmly. How long have you been planning this? His eyebrows lifted. What? The divorce. He looked away. Just briefly, but long enough. I don't know. That answer told me more than anything else. People who don't know usually answer quickly. People who lie need a second. I've been thinking about it. Thinking about it. Interesting. Not deciding. Not discussing. Not working on the marriage? Thinking. I nodded slowly. And why now? Richard leaned back. The confidence returned. That familiar confidence that had always appeared when he believed he controlled the situation. We've grown apart. I almost smiled. The phrase sounded rehearsed. Polished. Safe. The kind of sentence divorce attorneys probably heard 10 times a day. We've become different people. There it was. Another classic. I listened quietly. Richard mistook my calmness for weakness. People often do. I care about you. Of course. I always will. Naturally. But I think we're staying together because it's comfortable. Comfortable. 27 years. A daughter. A mortgage. Family holidays. Cancer scares. Job losses. 1,000 ordinary sacrifices. Reduced to comfortable. I nodded. Is there someone else? The question landed like a hammer. Richard froze. Not dramatically, but noticeably, for perhaps half a second. Then he recovered. No, the lie came quickly, smoothly, professionally, which told me he'd practiced it. I studied his face, the familiar lines around his eyes, the graying hair, the man I had spent more than half my life loving. Suddenly he felt like a stranger. I stood. Okay. Richard blinked. Okay. Now he looked confused. Very confused. Because this wasn't how he'd expected the conversation to go. There were supposed to be tears, arguments, negotiations. Instead, I simply walked into the kitchen. A few seconds later, he followed. Emily, what? That's it. I turned toward him. What exactly were you expecting? His mouth opened, then closed. He didn't know. Because what he actually expected was guilt, relief, freedom, a clean exit. What he got was uncertainty. And uncertainty scared people, especially people who believed they controlled outcomes. That night I slept better than I had in days. Not because I felt good, because something inside me had finally stopped fighting reality. The next morning I called an attorney. 2 days later, Richard did the same. And just like that, 27 years became paperwork. The divorce process moved quickly, almost suspiciously quickly. Richard seemed eager. Too eager. That alone told me everything. Vanessa wasn't waiting in the future. She was waiting in the present. The first settlement meeting took place 3 weeks later. A large conference room, expensive furniture, cold coffee, artificial smiles. Richard arrived with his attorney, a sharp-looking man named Bradley Stone, the kind of lawyer who probably billed by the breath, confident, aggressive, very sure of himself, at least initially. My attorney sat beside me quietly reviewing documents. The meeting began exactly how I expected. Bradley did most of the talking. Richard did most of the nodding. They presented financial statements, asset divisions, retirement accounts, property estimates. Then came the proposal, and suddenly everything made sense. Richard believed I was financially vulnerable. He believed the inheritance had been a broken watch. He believed I knew nothing. The arrogance would have been amusing if it weren't so insulting. Bradley adjusted his glasses. We believe this arrangement is fair. I reviewed the document. Fair. Interesting choice of word. The proposal heavily favored Richard. Not outrageously. Not enough to appear unreasonable. Just enough. Enough to benefit someone who assumed I wouldn't fight back. My attorney looked at me, waiting. I closed the folder, then asked a simple question. Has your client disclosed all assets? The room became quiet. Bradley smiled professionally. Of course. I nodded, then opened a different folder. The investigator's file. Richard's face immediately changed. Only slightly, but I noticed, because I was looking for it. Interesting. Bradley frowned. What is... I slid the first photograph across the table. Silence. Richard looked down. The color drained from his face. Not all at once. Slowly, like water disappearing from a shoreline. Bradley picked up the photograph. His expression shifted. Then he picked up another. And another. The room remained silent. Nobody rushed. Nobody interrupted. The evidence spoke for itself. Finally, Bradley lowered the final photograph. He looked directly at Richard. What is this? Richard didn't answer. His jaw tightened. The attorney's expression hardened immediately, because now he understood. He hadn't been given all the facts. Lawyers hate surprises, especially expensive ones. I calmly opened another folder. The apartment records, the shell company, the financial transfers, the gifts, the timeline. Every piece landed like another brick, heavy, unavoidable. Bradley's confidence vanished completely. For the first time since entering the room, he looked worried, genuinely worried. Richard stared at the table. The silence stretched, then snapped. Emily, I raised my hand. No. He stopped. I listened to you. The room became still again. I listened while you lied. Richard swallowed. I continued calmly. I listened while you planned a future that didn't include me. His eyes finally lifted. There was something new there. Fear. Not anger. Fear. Good. Fear meant reality had arrived. My attorney quietly slid another document forward. The trust. $18 million. The moment Bradley read the first page, he froze. Actually froze. Then read it again. Slowly. Carefully. His eyes widened. Richard frowned. What? Bradley didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at me, then at the trust, then back at Richard. The silence felt enormous. Finally, he spoke. Richard, his voice sounded different now. Less confident, less certain. You didn't mention this. Richard looked confused. What are you talking about? I watched realization arrive, one painful inch at a time. The trust, the inheritance, the assets, everything. Richard's face went pale, because suddenly the story he'd built in his head collapsed. I wasn't the abandoned wife with a broken watch. I wasn't dependent. I wasn't powerless. And for the first time in years, he understood that. The final settlement hearing took place 6 weeks later. The courtroom felt strangely quiet, almost peaceful. By then, most of the fighting had ended. Facts have a way of simplifying arguments. The judge reviewed documents carefully, asked questions, made notes. Then she looked directly at Richard. Her expression remained neutral, professional, controlled. Mr. Carter. Richard straightened. Yes, Your Honor. The judge folded her hands. Is there anything else your wife should know? The question hung in the air, heavy, still, waiting. Richard stared forward, completely silent. And somehow, that silence told me everything. Richard never answered the judge's question. Not because he didn't have an answer, because there wasn't a version of the truth that could help him anymore. The silence stretched for several seconds before the judge finally nodded and looked back at her paperwork. I sat quietly beside my attorney. 27 years. It was strange how an entire marriage could eventually become a stack of folders on a polished desk. Bank statements, property records, tax returns, photographs, evidence, years reduced to documentation. The judge issued her final rulings calmly. There was no dramatic speech, no cinematic moment. Real life rarely works that way. Richard would retain his business. I would keep the trust. The marital assets would be divided according to the settlement already negotiated. The affair itself wasn't what determined the outcome. The lies surrounding it did. The hidden property, the concealed financial transfers, the deliberate misrepresentations. Those things mattered. By the time the hearing ended, Richard looked 10 years older. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited near the entrance. Not because of us. There were always reporters. Always another story. Another scandal. Another lawsuit. Another tragedy. We simply blended into the crowd, which felt appropriate. The end of my marriage didn't deserve headlines. It deserved honesty. Richard approached me near the parking lot. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The November wind carried dry leaves across the pavement. Cars moved through the street beyond the courthouse. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life. Finally, he looked at me. "You knew." I nodded. "Yes." "How long?" "A while." He stared toward the ground, then asked the question I think he'd wanted to ask since the settlement meeting. "Why didn't you tell me?" The irony almost made me laugh. Why didn't I tell him? After 8 years of deception, after an apartment, after another relationship, after a second life. I looked at him carefully. "Because I wanted to see whether you'd tell me." His shoulders dropped. Not dramatically, just enough. The way people look when they finally realize they've lost an argument they were having with themselves. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Richard surprised me. "I did love you." The statement hung between us. I considered it, and strangely enough, I believed him, at least part of it. Life is rarely divided into villains and heroes. People can love someone and still betray them. They can care and still cause damage. They can mean well and still destroy things. That doesn't excuse the choices, but it explains them. "I know," I said quietly. Richard looked genuinely shocked. "You do?" "Yes." His eyes glistened briefly. "Not with tears, with regret. The kind that arrives too late." He nodded once, then walked away. That was the last private conversation we ever had. I watched him disappear into the crowd, and for the first time in years I felt something unexpected. Not anger, not satisfaction. Relief. Pure relief. The following months passed faster than I expected. There were financial meetings, trust documents, investment reviews, tax consultations, the practical realities of suddenly controlling $18 million. The number still felt unreal, but something Arthur said kept returning to me. "Your grandfather didn't leave you money. He left you responsibility." That distinction mattered. Very much. Because money alone changes nothing. Character decides what happens next. I spent the first few months learning everything I could about the trust. My grandfather had built it carefully over decades. Conservative investments, long-term thinking, no reckless risks, no shortcuts. The same values that had shaped his life shaped the trust. Eventually, I made my first major decision. A scholarship program. Small at first, focused on students whose families couldn't afford college. Especially students caring for aging parents or grandparents. People who quietly carried responsibility while nobody noticed. People like my grandfather. People like my father. People like me. A few months later, I funded a small business assistance program in Savannah. Nothing flashy, just practical help. The kind of support that gives hardworking people a chance to survive difficult years. Every decision seemed to bring me closer to understanding why my grandfather had trusted me. Not because I was special, because he believed I would remember other people. And perhaps he was right. Arthur remained a constant presence through all of it. We spoke often, sometimes about business, sometimes about family, usually about life. One spring afternoon, nearly a year after my father's funeral, he invited me to lunch near the marina. The water sparkled beneath bright sunlight. Sailboats drifted lazily across the harbor. Arthur seemed unusually quiet, more tired than normal. Older. Halfway through lunch, he reached into his jacket and handed me a sealed envelope. "For later." I frowned. "What is it?" "Just promise you'll read it." Something in his expression made me stop asking questions, so I nodded. "I promise." Arthur smiled. A small, peaceful smile. The kind people wear when they're satisfied with something. 11 days later, he died peacefully in his sleep. 81 years old. The phone call arrived early in the morning. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time afterward, staring at nothing. The world felt smaller without him. Not because he had all the answers, because he reminded people that integrity still mattered. A week after the funeral, I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, short, written in Arthur's careful handwriting. "Emily, your father spent most of his life fearing he would never become the man his father was. He spent so much time trying to measure up that he forgot something important. Love isn't earned through achievement. Neither is respect. Your grandfather understood that. Eventually, your father did too. There is one final item enclosed with this letter. It belongs to you." I looked deeper into the envelope. A small object slid into my hand. The watch. My grandfather's watch. Except it wasn't broken anymore. The crystal had been restored. The mechanism repaired. The hands moved smoothly. Tick, tick, tick. Steady. Alive. Beneath it rested a final note. Some things only work again after time, truth, and patience. I sat there for a long time holding that watch. listening to its quiet rhythm, thinking about my father, my grandfather, Arthur, even Richard. Life hadn't unfolded the way I imagined. Neither had love, neither had family. But maybe that was the point. The greatest inheritance wasn't the money. It wasn't the trust. It wasn't even the watch. It was understanding my own worth. Not through someone else's approval. Not through marriage. Not through sacrifice. Through truth. Last month I attended a scholarship ceremony funded by the trust. A young woman approached me afterward. She was the first person in her family to attend college. Nervous, excited, hopeful. Before leaving, she hugged me and said something I'll never forget. "Thank you for believing in me." I smiled, then touched the watch resting on my wrist. Because suddenly I understood. That was exactly what my grandfather had done for me. He believed in me before I believed in myself. And sometimes that's the greatest gift anyone can leave behind. If you're listening to this story and carrying old wounds from family marriage or betrayal, I hope you remember something I learned far too late. The people who fail to see your value do not determine it. And sometimes the most important inheritance isn't what someone leaves you. It's the chance to finally see yourself clearly. I'd love to know what part of this story stayed with you the most. Leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. We have many more stories about resilience, family redemption, and unexpected second chances to share with you. If this journey touched your heart, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one.